as many of you know, we've had from time to time, and at least 2 or 3 times a year, events about interesting and thoughtful books, and today we have a real treat. I am really pleased that Ben Gomes Casseres is here. Ben writes on strategy and with a special focus on business combinations and mergers and acquisitions, which, as many of you know through our work with you or for your clients and friends, is a major focus of Gennari and Aronson's work. Ben has researched this topic for more than 30 years. He's taught it to countless MBAs at Harvard Business School and now at Brandeis, and he has consulted for companies nationally, globally, really on the challenges of creating and managing the value of combinations and alliances. He now is a professor at Brandeis University, where he heads the Asper Center for Global Entrepreneurship. He has finished a brand new book, which are available in the back, Remix Strategy. And in this book, Ben really gives a thoughtful critique and a real focus on how you can create and manage the value through various combinations, alliances, mergers, acquisitions, and that always challenging topic of joint ventures. He sets it out and presents it over the course of 3 basic laws, which when I first started to read the book, I thought, well, these are sort of going to be self-evident. But he infuses the book with terrific examples and great visuals, and I'm delighted that he could join us today to talk a bit more about it. So we're going to have as usual, a terrific conversation about this topic. Then we'll open it up to Q&A, and I'll make sure that I give you folks plenty of time to meet and chat with Ben. Ben, welcome.
Larry, thank you. It's a real pleasure being here. Thank people for coming out on a beautiful morning, and look forward to exchanging ideas, and I hope my work is useful to you.
So Ben, there are, as we've talked about, so many business books, and you've written so many and been talking about this topic for so long. Mm-hmm. Why'd you write this book? What's new?
Yeah, so I have a nice cover, and I have an intriguing title. So let me tell you a little bit about the title. I was up in Camden, Maine just 2 weeks ago, and they had this Windjammer Festival. I don't know, some of you might have been there. And at the end, there was this dance, and there was a DJ. And the DJ was playing music for the dance. And what he was doing, he had a computer. And on the computer, he had 2 or 3 different songs that he was like moving all kinds of stuff, more equipment than you have over there. He had turntables, he had switches, and he was making music that's different from any of the tracks that he was starting with. And basically that's called the remix. So in the world of media, of music, of art, when we remix things, we're basically taking pieces from different art and mixing them together to create new value, to create something new, something fresh. And it strikes me that that's what companies do. They don't call it that necessarily, or maybe they will now, but that's what you do when you form a combination with another company. And even if that combination isn't a full merger, a full sort of hardwired combination, you are collaborating with the capabilities of another company and your company to create something new, to be entrepreneurial. So I felt that this kind of perspective is something that managers needed. You know, I asked this DJ, how do you know when it's right? How do you know what you're doing? He said, you got to feel it. Dreadlocks, you got to feel it. And, you know, I don't want, you know, Jeff Immel to say, you know, I feel the IoT area is going well. I'm going to mix something, you know. I don't want to hear Joe Tucci say, I feel the Federation is doing well. We're going to, you got to think hard about it. You got to think with economics, with law, with organizational science, and there is a deep literature which I've been steeped in terms of the academic research. So I want to bring that academic research, that sort of knowledge that we have about how organizations work and can do this remix, to what managers need, a roadmap to doing this strategically and logically and effectively.
So, big picture, thinking 3 rules.
Yeah.
You've got to have a total value here that is bigger than either of the players can get themselves. Mm-hmm. You've got to create an alliance, do a deal, where you can manage that joint value. And then it's got to be a sufficient return. That value has to return.
Those are the rules.
Yeah. So what's the most important consideration if someone comes to you and says, Ben, we're thinking about buying a company?
Yeah.
Understanding that you only have so much time to cover, and you have entrepreneurs with limited attention spans. What do you tell them?
Well, I think the first thing is that the business strategy behind the deal and beyond the deal is more important than the deal. The deal is a mechanism, it's a transaction in order to get this kind of recombination to work. But before the deal, there's the question of, is there a potential to create value? And how do we do that? There's 1 and 1 is 3 kind of notion. What are the elements? If you look at Staples and Office Depot, what's their logic? What is it that they think is going to happen that's going to either save costs or somehow create revenue that'll create value? The second thing is, well, how are you going to make it happen? And you mentioned already that there could be many ways of combining. In the case of Staples and Office Depot, it's a merger. But there could be other ways. I mean, you cannot merge sometimes with companies that don't want to merge or want to be bought out. And at that point, you need to form sometimes a joint venture or an alliance of some sort. And so how you do it is the important way to create that value. And then finally, of course, every company is in business to get that return. So how do we split the pie? And very often we don't like to talk about that. At least when it's a partnership kind of model. We think that sort of spoils the relationship. But it's very important to think about what you get in return. So I would say when you're either buying or selling a business, don't think of it as only that transaction, like my sale or my purchase. Think of it as, after this transaction is done, what have I created? Or what have they created? What have the buyers created? And if they've now created a new combination, that combination has to be able to create value, manage it properly, and then pay out in a way efficiently. So maybe that's a long story, but if I boil it down too much, people forget it. The joke, you try to boil down everything into one word for the exam, and then you forget it when you get into the exam. So, there's a whole book on it. Let me put it that way.
You've got a number of thoughtful examples where it seems to me when someone comes in and talks with you, you don't assume that a transaction is going to happen. In fact, you have a terrific piece on, you want a partner or a vendor?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. The example I use in there is a telecom company, which I'll remain nameless. This did not work out very well for this telecom company, where they're needing a piece of software, a piece of billing software. And in order to get that, they knew they didn't have it in-house, so they went outside. And they went outside and they found a small company and they said, let's call this a partnership. We are going to be a partner with you, small company.
It's a great word.
It's a beautiful word.
Phrase.
And it's overused because it feels good. And it's a problem when you overuse it and you don't mean it. Right? They'll come back to you and say, well, where's my partner discount? Or, how come you're not treating me like you thought the partner was? So in this particular case, they tried to develop something new with this partnership, but their mentality was still the sort of vendor mentality, which is, we have a contract and we're just going to kind of drive them to do it. And if they don't fulfill it, then we can take them to court. That's the sort of the default of a vendor relationship. It turns out that this thing was much more complex than either party had foreseen. And so in the end, they really couldn't develop that product on time, failed their commitment to the government, foreign government, to roll out this telecom line. And therefore, they were confused about whether it's a real partnership, whether it's a vendor. And they probably would have been better off to say, this is not a partnership. Let's do it as a vendor. Let's really contract this and drive it. Or if we're going to do it as a partnership, then let's manage it with the proper governance. Because a partnership means that you have a way to manage the relationship because there are things that are going to come up. Like, we didn't know exactly how this product is going to work, so we got to develop it together.
So they blew the first rule.
They totally blew that, yeah.
It's easier to say that everyone should be thinking about joint value.
Yeah.
Can you provide some of the examples, whether they're in the book or in your consulting practice, where people have really gotten that right, where they've thought about the joint value in the way that is really going to ensure that the other two rules are followed?
Yeah, so, the example one of the examples I use, and I have examples from many industries, but one that you might know from going to the movies is Pixar and Disney. If you know the history of that, Pixar was, when it first started working on Toy Story, which is really its breakout movie together with Disney, it was almost dead as a company. Steve Jobs had put so much money into it, and over time, it just wasn't able to produce something big and commercial. It had some software, and it has a few clips here and there, but it decided it wanted to make a full-length movie. And for that, it had no skills really in doing that. So it created an alliance with Disney. This was a very kind of loose alliance. And in that process, it said it went to the Disney University. It learned how Disney did movies. And at the same time, Disney learned more about how this computer-aided cartooning worked. And so it created Toy Story. And that became, a blockbuster, which then Disney could roll out through its channels. So here you have a startup with a unique technology, an established firm that doesn't understand that unique technology yet, and because of their channels and their ways of making movie, the Pixar expertise in the actual computing, we created a combination that didn't exist before, and that created a whole new genre of movies and was very successful and continues to be so. So what happens next? So they're great, 1 and 1 is 3, well managed because you got this result. Over time, the Pixar part became more and more valuable. They became really, really good. So they started other movies, Finding Nemo and those kinds of things. And over time, Steve Jobs, started wanting more value, more sharing of the value, this third rule. And what happened is they then created another contract, and that contract was no longer 90-10, but more 50-50. And that still was kind of chafing at the neck. And basically, it ended up that Disney bought Pixar for $7.5 billion, which turned out to be a great investment for Steve at the time. And then I think what we now know is that Disney itself has transformed itself. So when I think about Remix, again, it's not just a single deal. It's that you can take your company into a different direction by properly adding pieces, and not just Pixar, but adding other pieces over time that has, sort of revitalized this.
Great illustration of the continuum.
Yeah.
So you had 3 or 4 different deals.
Exactly.
We start, we get in the middle, we adjust it for the joint value, and then ultimately a sale.
Yeah.
Are there industries, market segments, market spaces, where in your research and your thinking, they get the 3 rules down better than in others, whether it's digital media, Internet of Things, old line manufacturing, lots of M&A happening.
Yeah, so my starting point is that these rules apply everywhere. Okay, I'm sure there's exceptions, but I've been working in everything from computers, Internet of Things, software, to media, to airlines, to oil companies. And my examples in the book are from all these things. So I feel that it applies in many places. So I would say, as a first cut, it applies everywhere. Now, it's easier to measure in some places than others. So when you look at Staples and Office Depot, okay, you can look at stores, you can look at revenue, you can look at cost, you can look at returns, things like that. Even Anheuser-Busch and Miller. It's going to be a little trickier there, and whether that actually passes is another question. But these are established business with established costs and well-known market parameters. The Internet of Things is a wholly different ballgame, because there we're talking about really emerging parameters. We don't know what the market really is like. We don't know which technologies will be the winners. We don't have major established companies that have established ways of doing things. And so when it comes to measuring, what is it that we're adding to each other? If I'm Medtronic and I'm going to work with a hospital to create some way of communicating my data through you, which would be a classic sort of IoT thing, it's hard to measure the actual result of that. And so I think the way I think about this, you need to measure, you need to understand the logic of it, and it just gets a little harder in some of these fields that are emerging. No less important, but harder. And because of that, the second rule, which is how do you put it together, becomes key. When you don't really know what the world will look like, you might need to place some bets that are not the same as a big $100 billion merger between 2 beer companies. And those bets might be alliances, small investment, venture investments, joint ventures, consortia, and of course that's what we see in IoT. And I don't think we know exactly where that's going to go. But it's one of the fields I follow carefully to see, in a way, whether, how this is going to apply.
Ben, when you consult with sellers, and in our practice, we've done transactions and sold companies to Boeing and Qualcomm and Apple. The folks at Apple, when you're a seller, don't seem to have read your book. And they're going to tell you.
It's new.
Here's the value.
Yeah.
Here's how we're going to extract it and the like. What do you tell someone who's on one side of perhaps a transaction where they don't have all of the expected leverage and insight and understanding that they might otherwise have if they were on an equal playing field?
Well, a couple of things about that. I think if you're on the selling side, think about selling a house. The key question there is, what do the buyers want?
Right.
It's not what I like in the house. It's really, what is it going to look like to the buyer? And so ultimately, unless you're selling a small company to another person and it remains a standalone company, If that company is going to be incorporated into Apple or something like that, the question is, what can Apple do with it? How does this then add value to the Apple, empire? And so there it becomes a question of combination. So when you're selling, you're also creating a new combination. And it's in that combination that Apple will see value. And then that'll set a maximum, I suppose, to what Apple is willing to pay for it.
So sellers got to do some homework.
Absolutely do
Where
some
do I
homework.
fit?
Absolutely do the homework. I mean, that due diligence more than go check, what the legal forms are and are they correct. The due diligence here is strategic. What is my business and what are the related businesses that actually might add up to something for this company, and actually what are the competing offers that this company might be looking at, and how does my house stand up compared to their house? So I think there's a tremendous amount of homework. What I try to do, one way to think about the book, is to kind of give you a little bit of a roadmap for the kind of areas that you ought to look at strategically. Even if you're doing a sort of standard due diligence of a sale or a purchase, it's a question of doing it so that you hit the strategic points that are important for the buyer in this case. And so I try to point to what those are.
And you've got some practical tips. Beware of chemistry. Talk about that.
Yeah.
And one that's near and dear to my heart, don't leave all of it to the lawyers.
Okay.
Right? Talk about those couple of rules of thumb and guideposts of the way. It's very entertaining.
Yeah,
if you haven't read it, you really need to. It's really fun.
I'm glad you find the humor in the lawyer's part. Let me start with that since you brought it up. So I do say that the contract is too important to be left to the lawyers. And
even brilliant lawyers.
Even brilliant lawyers. Even Larry and Aronson and company. And that is because no contract can actually encompass the full complexity of the actual business arrangement. Now, that is even more so when it's an ongoing business arrangement. We'll call it a partnership of some sort. Those partnerships, when you put down on paper what you think you're going to do, 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, whatever, the world changes, and it's a different ballgame. And so this contract, good lawyers, like you guys, will probably put in place the probable flexibility that the contract will allow for governance and evolution and change. And so even though the contract there is in a way incomplete, it has a gap, it hasn't totally covered everything, it'll have a governance structure that will help you get there. So I mean it tongue-in-cheek, don't leave it to the lawyers, but actually the lawyers are critical in creating a proper governance structure and creating sort of the boundaries. One of the examples that I studied very deeply is Xerox and Fuji Photofilm, and actually kind of cut my teeth on that 20 years ago. This has been in business for 60 years now. And they put together a contract that has very clear territorial boundaries. And it's because of those territorial boundaries, Fuji Xerox is in Japan, Xerox is in the US, and never the twain shall meet. Because of that, they actually have been able to cooperate very well. They believe good fences make good neighbors. That is a very important contractual principle of that relationship. Beyond that, they have totally torn up their contracts every 3, 4, 5 years. Even though it's a 10-year contract, 5 years later it gets renegotiated. And that is what has helped them actually stay alive and become now a $10 billion joint venture, 50-50 joint venture. Very interesting case. So I do think, this is all driven by business, right? So it's a business strategy that tells you, in a way, what that contract should look like and how the governance should be.
Are there some aspects of combinations, particularly as you get to the contract, that you ought to leave fuzzy, which is, of course, contrary to the lawyer's instinct? Like to button all of this down.
Yeah.
In your experience, in your thought, in your consultancies,
yeah,
going through this, are there areas that ought to remain a little bit ambiguous for the good of the joint
I think
alliance, joint value?
I'd love to have that conversation, further conversation with you on that. My instinct would be there are going to be a lot of fuzzy things in there, even after you do all your homework and you button down as much as you can. And they're there because of the nature of the task. They're there because you're doing something like the Internet of Things where you don't really know exactly who the players are going to be. So it's almost not because you choose to let's not talk about this. It's because you don't have the facts to talk about it or even know the parameters. So what you do in that case is create I mentioned the word governance, I mean basically a decision protocol, system of how we're going to go about addressing questions that we haven't really thought about yet, or certainly that we don't have the answer to yet. So that stays fuzzy because those answers are going to be fuzzy. We don't know them. And we're not going to try to pin them down because we don't know how the best answer would be. The governance structure that helps to do that isn't too fuzzy. I mean, if that's fuzzy,
so you
then
can build in some structure.
You can build in structure to manage the fuzziness.
Trust me doesn't always work. Talk about chemistry and how that can mess up a deal.
So, I mean, right now you can look at Hewlett-Packard and Oracle. If you don't know that particular case, that's a wonderful one. Not for them or not for HP. I'm not sure who you think wins and loses.
Lawyers always do well.
Lawyers always do well. So the question there is, did they have a contract? And it's a little long story. It's in the book, but they had a very, very long relationship. If you go back, like 5 years ago, to any kind of forum where people are talking about partnerships, HP Oracle is the poster boy. They were like perfect about it. And then it turns out that through a number of things that happened, Oracle, in a way, sort of pulled the rug out of some of that relationship. And HP complained. They said, we had a contract. You can't do this to me. And it turns out they didn't have a contract. I mean, they had a contract, but they were pieces that were not fully buttoned down. That, as a lawyer, you might say, why didn't they do this? And it turns out the court, I think, has ruled that there was an implicit contract. And now I'm treading on your toes here, so I'm going to stay out of it. But the issue there is that the trust, which was built over time, which depended on people knowing each other, is very important. Obviously, you want to deal with people that you feel you can trust. At the same time, these are important business investments. And from one day to the next, or 1 month to the next, people change. And that happened in this case. People move, people change. Sometimes they get promoted out of the alliance and they become higher up. And so this alliance no longer has a godfather or godmother to take care of it. And so if it depends on trust or pure personal chemistry, it's weak. It cannot withstand some of these sort of throes of competition. The Xerox case I just mentioned to you, there's a contrast to that, Honeywell in Japan, where they did not have such a nice contract as I described for Xerox. And there was basically a godfather who took care of make sure the Japanese and the Americans work well together. And when he literally got promoted to CEO at Honeywell, that didn't have that care anymore. And those two parties now started fighting about competing in China, and that basically fell apart. So I am always, saying, sort of build trust, find mechanism that create this kind of reciprocity of trust, but don't trust it blindly. And by the same token, when we find good chemistry with the other party, and it looks like we should do a deal because we just love, talking to each other, that's also risky because one has to think about the alternatives. And if you have shareholders, then they require that you look at their interests rather than the chemistry you feel. And if it's your family business, then your family, you owe it to them, I suppose, to look at all the possibilities.
And Ben, it strikes me that this is particularly relevant when people do an earn-out transaction.
Yeah.
They get some money up front. The rest is subject to milestones, whether they're based on performance metrics or other subjective factors. As lawyers, we look at those and say you should assume, if you're the seller, that all you get at the closing is the purchase price, and don't assume you're going to get more. When you talk with companies that are on either side of an earn-out, who ought to be reading the book and thinking about this joint value, because that is the whole point of the structure, what do you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, they're getting into a partnership. It's not a sale where you walk away. I mean, you could say the bottom, the minimum is what you get at that closing. Don't expect more. That would be a nice way of saying, zero follows after that. But if the earnout really has a role in, let's say, creating this transfer effectively or creating this new combination effectively, then I think it would be structured that there is some incentive there. That you want, as a buyer, that the management that stays in place for a while has an incentive to produce and help this transfer and help this integration to succeed. So there ought to be some return from doing well in that, what I would call the partnership phase, that earn-out phase. And so at that point, it's not just a sale, but it is a joint venture. And one has to think, in a way, maybe not as formally, about how do you manage decisions that you hadn't thought about before, and who's in control of that. So I guess that's what I would try to put a little bit of a perspective on that aspect of it.
How do you talk to companies that might come and see you that just can't get a deal done? Is there a situation, are there a set of factors, are there warning signs where you say to a particular business manager, board, don't do this deal?
Yeah, I mean, if 1 and 1 is 2.2 and a half or 2.1, forget it. I mean, it's not close enough. You need a margin of error. I mean, if you need 13 lawyers and business people on both sides of the table to figure out what is it exactly that I'm adding and you're adding, and why does that matter to customers? Right? In the end, there's a value-added equation that either your buyer or your supplier or your competitor is going to have an effect on. So if there isn't potential value there that is very clearly stated, this is not about building empires. This is not about, oh, we need top-line growth, so let's go buy something. I mean, if you do that, then you don't necessarily create no value. And so I would say that's the first place where you might watch for warning signs. The second would be the second law, which is if we can't get the governance to work or agree on the governance, and the third law, agree on the split of value so that we can create this sort of, 1 and 1 is 3 or 4 or 5, then they're stuck on that. And maybe I'm too much of an economist to think that if there is a lot of value to be had from combining, we ought to be able to, with proper facilitation and lawyers, get some structure going. But sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, sometimes the personalities or sometimes the other alternate, motives of both sides just don't mesh. And so when you look for a partnership, you look for complementary assets that create value. Then you look for compatible strategies and common vision. So the idea that somehow we can create something together that can then result in more value. And you look for, is there a proper return to both sides? And is there a fair and accepted sharing of value? And if those three things, which go back to my 3 laws, if those 3 things don't add up, then that partnership again, in this case.
Got to be fair to both sides.
Exactly.
You're a student of the markets. You see a lot of M&A. What are you looking for the balance of this year? Where are the most interesting deals happening?
Every day, I wake up, let's see what happened today. I follow Deal Book or one of those things, and just every day there's a surprise. So there are a few things we know. There are things that are going to be closing. I mentioned Stapleton already. There's questions around Yahoo, exactly how that's going to spin out. That's a spin out. HP, that's a divestment. So actually, some of these deals that we now see are combinations in the reverse. So the HP case is, you ask yourself, are these 2 pieces, should they be combined if they were separate? And if the answer there is, well, there isn't a lot of added value, 1 and 1 is 3, then maybe they shouldn't be combined and maybe they should be split. Now, obviously, it's in a way a lot harder. Over time, a company builds a common core, and it's really hard to split them. But very often, that's a way to create value. I mean, look at Covidien. Covidien came out of Tyco, right? Tyco International. It split out into a number of pieces, into 3 pieces and then 3 pieces again. They're like 9 children and 18 grandchildren of Tyco, which are all managed much better than the original Tyco was.
So same rules for divestment. Same
rules, in a sort of in the reverse. And of course, in the Covidien case, it then could double down on what it's doing and then merge with Medtronic. So I don't actually know what to expect next, except in these kinds of spaces, like I just described, the Internet of Things. In any space where there is a disruption or a major change in technology or actually in markets like China or something like that, suddenly the folks who are established in the business have to look again at their business, because there are going to be new players and there's new opportunities. And at that point, our capabilities, our assets, in a way, need to be adjusted. And I think about that as we now have to remix a little bit. We have to add something from the outside. We have to at least ally with a piece on the outside. And so this has happened in computers. It happened in biotechnology with pharma. And they're treating it very well now. That's a place where this kind of alliance management has reached a very high level of professionalism because they depend so much on biotech. But computers, biotech, software, Internet of Things, cloud, data analytics, all of these things, from day to day, there will be a few mergers, but many more partnerships short of merger. And those could be venture investments, they could be bets, or they could be alliances, they could be consortia. And so those don't make the papers as quickly as the big mergers. The big mergers happen when there's consolidation. So the big mergers will keep happening in the large spaces. It's beer, or it's some large consumer goods or energy. Energy would be another area where now, certainly with energy prices going the way they are, in a way the assets get readjusted. So depending on what your asset base is, when energy prices fall or gas, becomes plentiful, your asset composition becomes different, and people are more likely to merge.
Ben, we frequently encounter people who are going to take on venture investors, private equity investors.
Yeah.
Partnerships.
Yeah.
Should be a partnership.
Yeah.
Talk about how you think about those. They're not pure M&A transactions, but they are primarily financial in nature, at least from one perspective. If you're counseling a company who says, should we even think about taking on a private equity investor? I don't like that direction generally that I've heard it's going to take my company, or a venture investor.
Yeah.
What do you say to them?
Yeah, I think you have to figure out whether it's purely financial or not. My wife asked me the other day, Shark Tank, are those the alliances you talk about? She's a doctor. She doesn't get into the business side
That's
of things.
entertainment. Right?
Yeah, well, no, actually, so some of the deals that these guys are saying, and women, they're saying, we're going to give you $500,000 and go ahead and do this, and this is the return we want on it. That's a purely financial kind of investment, and they're making their bets. Those are bets. On the other hand, sometimes they say, we'll give you this, and I have another company in my portfolio that the two together will really, can really bump up your product. And that now becomes a little bit more of a partnership because we need real capabilities and assets, not purely financial, to be somehow put into conversation and not necessarily merged, but to collaborate with this venture. So I would say if you're accepting this kind of investment, I guess don't do like the telecom. Just because they say they're going to be good partners doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Beware of chemistry, as you said.
Beware of chemistry.
Right.
So what is the content of this partnership? What are you going to get outside of the financial and the commitments you have in the financial contract? What are you going to get? Whether it's market access or technology access or management capability. And that's an important part. That's like the in-kind part. And I guess that's how I would think about it in terms of an investment.
Broad spectrum, rules apply in a variety of situations.
Yeah.
Ben, I think we're going to leave it there. I want to give people a chance to meet you and visit with Wellesley Booksellers at the back of the room. I want to thank them for coming. I want to thank Harvard Business Review Press for being so generous in connecting us to you. I want to thank you folks for coming. If you take a look at galawpartners.com, you'll see our next event is on launching, building, and financing connected products on October 29th. Likely at Babson. So please join us, and please join me in welcoming and thanking Ben Gomes Casseres, and thank you.
Great.
Grab the book.
Thank you.